When you hear the phrase, the law, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's probably this image of a single, giant, intimidating book of rules. But it's not really like that at all. Law is actually an incredibly organized system. Think of it less like one giant book and more like a building's blueprint. It has a hidden structure, and today, we're going to unfold that blueprint together.
So let me ask you, is all law the same? The answer is a definite, resounding no. And understanding its different categories isn't just some academic exercise for lawyers. It's actually the key to seeing how our entire society is put together, from huge global treaties all the way down to a simple dispute with your neighbor. So, here's our game plan for this explainer. We'll start by looking at law's hidden blueprint. Then we'll break down the 4 foundational ways it's divided. From there, we'll zoom into the private sphere, see how these laws are actually applied in the real world, and finally, we'll connect it all back to your everyday life. Okay, let's dive right in. Jurists and legal scholars have 4 main ways of slicing and dicing the entire body of law. You can think of these as the main pillars that support the entire legal structure. First up, public versus private law. Public law is all about the relationship between you and the state. We're talking your constitutional rights, criminal law, that kind of thing. Private law, on the other hand, deals with the relationships between us as private citizens or groups, things like contracts, property disputes, or family matters. So it's the difference between the state setting the rules for everyone versus the state acting as a referee between 2 people.
Next, we've got criminal versus civil law. This is a big one. Criminal law is about punishing actions that are considered harmful to society as a whole. Civil law, though, is about settling disputes between private parties and providing a remedy, usually financial, for a wrong that's been done. So one is about punishment and the other is about resolution.
Now here's where it gets really interesting, because this difference plays out in a huge way in court. For a criminal conviction, the prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and that is a very high bar to clear. But in a civil case, the standard is just on the balance of probabilities, which basically means more likely than not. This difference in proof is massive, and it's why it is so much harder to convict someone of a crime than it is to find them liable in a civil lawsuit.
Our third divide is substantive versus procedural law. This can sound a little abstract, but I promise it's simple. Substantive law is the what. It's the actual substance of the law that defines our rights and tells us what's illegal, like the penal code. Procedural law is the how. It's the step-by-step rule book that the courts have to follow to enforce that substantive law. So one sets out the rules of the game, and the other explains exactly how the game must be played. And finally, we have municipal versus international law. Now, municipal here doesn't just mean your local town. It refers to the domestic law that applies within the borders of a single country, like the Constitution of Somalia. International law, well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It governs how different countries interact with each other through things like treaties and customs. One is local, the other is global.
Okay, so now that we have our 4 big divides, let's zoom in on one specific area to really see how this works in practice. We're going to take a dive into the world of private law. Once we're inside private law, the first big area we hit is civil law. And this is really the law of our personal lives. It shapes everything from getting married or divorced to buying a house to protecting a brilliant idea you might have with a copyright. It governs our relationships and our property.
Next up is commercial law, and you can basically think of this as the operating system for our entire economy. I mean, every time you tap your card to buy something or sign a business contract, you're engaging with this system. It governs the whole shebang, from the smallest corner store to the biggest global corporations.
You know, the open ocean might seem a bit lawless, but it actually has its own unique rulebook, maritime law. A ship at sea is kind of like its own little floating island, so there are special laws for everything, from which country's flag it flies under to how you handle a crime that's committed miles and miles from shore.
And just like the sea, the sky has its own very specific set of rules. Aviation law governs everything about air travel, which country an airline belongs to, the safety standards they have to meet, and even how to handle crimes like hijacking. It's a huge global system that really got going after the Chicago Convention of 1944.
So we have all these different categories of law.
But how do they actually get applied in the real world? Let's take a look at the process and see how we go from a simple local lawsuit to a really complex global dispute.
The process for a civil case usually follows a pretty clear path. It all kicks off when a plaintiff files a complaint. The defendant then gets a chance to provide a written answer. After that comes discovery, which is just a fancy term for both sides formally exchanging all their information. And then finally, the court issues its official decision, the judgment. It's a structured conversation, really, all designed to get to the truth of the matter.
Now, that whole process works pretty well inside one country. But what happens when a legal issue crosses borders? What happens when the laws of two different nations are in direct conflict with each other?
Let's use a real-world puzzle to make this clear. A Somali citizen marries a Canadian citizen. They have a property dispute. So, which country's court gets to decide the case? Somalia's or Canada's? This is exactly the kind of complicated problem that private international law was created to solve.
Private international law basically breaks these complex problems down into three core questions. First, jurisdiction. Which court even has the authority to hear the case? Second, applicable law. Okay, once you've got a court, which country's laws should it use? And third, enforcement. If a decision is made in one country, will another country actually recognize and enforce it? You've got to answer all three to get a resolution.
All right, let's bring all of this home and see how this hidden blueprint isn't just something for textbooks. It's actively shaping your world every single day.
This entire classification system, it's not just academic. It truly is the invisible software running in the background of our society. It structures our interactions, it protects our rights, and it gives us a predictable way to resolve our disputes.
I mean, just think about your own day. Your employment contract, that's governed by labor law. Buying a product, you just dealt with commercial law. Getting married or divorced, that's all civil law. Your rights as a citizen fall under public law. Even a simple dispute with a neighbor can be a matter of private law. It just shows how these categories are constantly at play in our lives, whether we notice them or not.
And it all comes back to these four. These are the foundational divides, the main pillars that hold up the entire legal system we've been talking about.
I think the source material sums it all up perfectly. It says that classification doesn't create new laws. It just organizes the ones we already have based on their unique characteristics. It gives us a clear map to a very complex territory. So I'll leave you with a final thought. Now that you have the blueprint, take a look around. From the news you read to the products you buy, which of these classifications of law shaped your day today? I bet if you think about it, you might be surprised by the answer. Thanks for watching The Explainer.